Right, I put questions and something to eat because I thought we were eating after.
If you do get a concession, and say you are in the street of shops, and your neighbour comes to you, do you have to disclose that it was a concession? Because normally it's willing tenant, willing landlord, isn't it? So do you have to disclose that you've got a concession from the landlord? Or can you just say, this is what I pay?
Well, actually, if you get a personal concession, the letter that grants it will almost certainly say, let's say you're paying £30,000 a year and he gives you a concession to £25,000. The letter will say that the headline rent remains at £30,000.
Right, yeah.
So actually, if that went to, if you wanted,
Yeah.
somebody else wanted to use that as evidence, it wouldn't
It's the
count.
headline rent, yeah.
Because it is literally one concession for one person under certain circumstances. And what the landlord is effectively saying is, the rent's still £30,000, but I will accept 25. Now what you must avoid is the landlord saying, all right, I'll give you a personal concession, let's say I reduce your rent by £5,000, but I want you to pay that back over the course of the next 5 years. So your rent will increase by £1,000 every year for the next 5 years to pay back the personal concession. Because actually, that's not much of a deal. You know, it's not even a concession, it's more like a loan. A good landlord would look at you and say, right, here's somebody that's valuable, they've paid their rent on time, they've been a good tenant for a long time, I want to see them stay in business, and therefore I will reduce their rent. You probably won't get huge reductions, but you know, any reduction would be worthwhile. And if you catch a landlord at a time when they too are fearful of having empty shops, you know, a void so that their own income goes down, then they might give you a decent concession. They just might. But you've got to demonstrate to them that it's genuine, you know, because it's too easy to just chance your arm. You know, there's nothing to stop anybody from asking their landlord for a personal concession any time. But they would want to see some evidence that you need it in order to keep trading. And you know, I say this is a very good year to do it because quite simply, I think going forward, you know, retail is probably going to be the worst it's been for 10, 15, 20 years. Certainly Christmas was for retailers. You know, probably the worst Christmas in certainly 20 years. And I can't really foresee that getting much better. And if we go back into recession, you know, we've now had 1 quarter of negative growth. It takes 2 quarters to be officially in recession. So if come April, we've got another quarter of negative growth and we're back in recession, I think the consumer confidence will collapse. And then it's definitely in your landlord's interest to keep you going, you know, until we get out of this mess. They'll probably only give you a concession for 1 year. But at the end of that 1 year, if things haven't got better, you ask for it to be renewed for another year.
Can you approach them for a concession at any time? Does it have to tie with the rent review?
No,
Any
anytime.
time at all?
Anytime, but it's a good point actually, because if you've got a rent review coming up and you go to the landlord and say, let's say it's in 6 months' time, and you go to the landlord and say, I'm struggling, I'd like to reduce my rent, then almost certainly he will tie the reduction in rent to settling a review early. So you know, he'll say, all right, I give you £5,000 off, but I want an agreed rent now for your review, and it will be more than you know it would otherwise be because you're over a barrel.
So again, it's not
best
much of a deal really.
get the review out of the way first, and then go and ask for it.
And what about in our situation? Because I suspect I'm in the same situation as the gentleman over there, and that I've missed the window for my lease renewal because it's coming up in 5-6 weeks' time, and that my landlord just wants to continue on existing terms. But what? Well,
You
when you say we do,
the problem with lease renewal is that your lease will have a very specific window. Might be 6 months at the renewal period.
I think it is, yeah.
Right. If you don't start it within that period, then at the end you've lost your security of tenure at the end of it.
Right.
Now that's technically the case, although there are lots of examples of tenants doing that and taking the case to court and basically throwing themselves on the mercy of court and saying, look, all right, I missed my window, but
That's what I understood, yeah.
but you may well lose anyway. You know, it just depends. Technically, if you don't renew within the window, then you lose your right to renew. So but you need to read your lease because different for every lease. It's good that your lease hasn't expired yet. That's really good. Because if your lease had expired and you were just letting it run on, well then you're in a much weaker position. Landlord, the great thing about lease renewal is that it is the only time when rents can go down as well as up. It's an open market rent. So you just get the evidence from the street, and if the rent is considerably less than you're already paying, then that's what you can ask for. And the landlord has to renew on at least the same terms. So if you've got a 15-year lease, you can demand a lease that's the same length of time, 15 years. He can't say, I'll only give you a 5-year lease.
What happens if you can't reach an agreement? Does that goes to court?
Goes to High Court. All lease renewals go to the High Court. But it's very rare for small shops to go to the High Court because it's too expensive. Certainly, big stores would do it, big chains would do it. But it is very expensive. You want to avoid it at all costs. Although, the great thing is, if it goes to High Court and the judge feels that the landlord has been unreasonable and you've made an offer, and the offer is within 10% of what the judge then agrees is the right rent, he awards costs against the landlord. But it works the other way. So he could award costs against you. And that's one of the good things about, the two ways to settle disputes is either by arbitration or by independent expert. Independent expert, each party pay their own fees. Arbitration, the surveyor can decide that one party has been so unreasonable that they should pay the other party's fees. And that's a gamble, which is why it's so much better. Get represented, do it by negotiation, make sure you've got a good commercial surveyor to represent you. They'll charge 5 to 10% of the final rent agreed, which will amount to hundreds of pounds. They'll save you thousands, because whatever reduction they negotiate for you lasts for 5 years. Not just their fee is a one-off, but the reduction is every year for 5 years. There are also other cases where you may have a property that's got what's called a restricted covenant. They're quite rare now, but once upon a time, there's a shop in Garden Street, for instance, that can only be a newsagent. That's the only thing it can be. So it couldn't be turned into anything else at all. Its lease says it is a newsagent. That's so restrictive that earns the tenant a reduction on their rent, because actually he can only ever sell it to another newsagent, or sell it to somebody that wants to continue being a newsagent. So, restrictive covenants like that are very rare, but if you've got one, they're a pain in the neck, but they do earn you less rent. And if you're happy being a newsagent, that's fine.
Have you seen proliferation in traders' associations? People actually coming together and trying to kind of protect rents?
Yeah, I think people are actually. I think they are. I think that they realise that united you stand, divided you fall, and particularly around rent reviews. If you don't talk to your neighbours and find out what they're paying and tell them what you're paying, then you're easy meat, you're easy pickings. And the sad thing is that very often people have a rent review. If they're once every 5 years, that's it. They forget about it. They don't tell other people. They don't go out and tell their neighbours, I just had a rent review and I'm paying £20 a square foot, because that's really valuable information. I know when we were doing this in the North Lane Traders Association, there was one chap in particular who came, had a review 6 months' time, wanted to use this service, and he wasn't a member, so we said, it's only available for members. The membership's 30 quid. It's still only 30 quid actually, that's a decade later. So he joined, and we measured up his shop and gave him the diagram with all the working, and he actually got quite a good deal out of it. And then the following year we went and said, you'd like to renew your membership? And he said, oh no, I haven't got a rent review. Why would I renew my membership? And you couldn't see that if you want the Traders Association to be there to help other people, then it would be good for 30 quid a year to renew your membership.
Is there anything else you can ask for, such an improvement?
Not really, because most people have a fully repairing and insuring lease, which means that they're responsible for all the repairs in the building, and they're also responsible for all the dilapidations at the end of the lease. So, the landlord will come in and he'll go through the building like a fine-tooth comb, And you say, right, I want a new roof, new ceilings, new windows, and once again, you've got to horse trade. You've got to basically say, no, come on, nothing wrong with that roof. I'll repair the roof, it doesn't need a new one. And eventually you come to an agreement on the list of stuff that you've got to do to be able to walk away from your lease. What most people do, of course, if they don't do that, they pass the lease on. If you pass the lease on, so you assign the lease to a third party, you guarantee that third party until they assign the lease. So I could give you my shop, you go broke, the landlord comes back to me to pay the rent, until you assign the lease to somebody else, and then you're responsible. Well, it used to be that the first person that signed the lease, the very first person that signed the lease, was responsible right the way to the end. It could go through 50 people, and that first person was responsible. And there was a flower shop in Trafalgar Street, actually, where this happened. She's lady signed the lease, 15 years later, she got a rent demand, and actually had to go back and take the shop over and continue to run it as a flower shop. Now that changed, because that's really onerous and quite unfair, it changed so that you're only responsible for paying the rent for the person that you assign the lease to, until they then assign it to somebody else, and then you're scot-free.
Still a danger, though, isn't it?
Yeah, you have to be really careful who you assign the lease to. But somewhere along the line, this building is accruing dilapidations. If you're not doing repairs, somewhere along the line, somebody is going to have to do them. If you're lucky, you can assign it to somebody else before you have to do anything, and then it's their responsibility. And they'll assign it to somebody else, and they'll assign it to somebody else. And when it comes to the end of the track, is when the lease needs to be renewed. Because then the landlord can say, all right, you have a perfect right to renew the lease, you've got security of tenure under the 1954 Landlord and Tenant Act, but you have not fulfilled your obligations, you have not repaired this building, and it's in your lease that you've got to, therefore unless you do, you're not getting a lease renewal. And if you say, oh, well, okay, then I won't bother to renew, you're still going to do the dilapidations. You're still responsible for them. And that's usually where, push comes to shove, and people have to shell out a lot of money to fix their buildings. I don't know why anybody would take a lease, to be honest. And on that note, thank you very much. Thank you for listening. There's a little brochure here, how to survive a rent review.